Growing up within evangelicalism, I knew this story very well. See, back in 1620, William Bradford and William Brewster led a group of persecuted Christian separatists to America's shores to establish a free Christian colony at Plymouth. Other Puritan colonies soon followed, and in doing so, they planted the seeds of what would become the United States of America. Some years later, devout Christian men perfectly determined to throw off the shackles of the English monarchy to establish a free Christian nation. Upon winning their independence, they drafted the Constitution rooted in biblical values and principles. For nearly 200 years, the United States thrived because of divine blessing. It rose to become the most dominant world power as a nation, it was a nation ordained by God that was governed by Christian morality. Then in the 1960s, we rebelled against our Christian heritage, beginning with the landmark decision to ban prayer in schools. Since then, this country has been spiraling out of control, and it's surely going to fall unless Christians can reclaim the United States as the Christian nation that it was founded to be. You know, as a young man and in my youth, I really found this story very inspiring. I had my world shaken when I learned that it was a myth. You see, I had to, and I learned this not in some liberal institution, but studying under conservative evangelical institutions where devout Christian historians demonstrated that this is really a gross mischaracterization of American history. Historical reality aside, though, Christian nationalists continue to push this narrative to support their vision of America to establish a distinctively Christian nation. The problem with the Christian nationalist view of American history is that it paints its founding fathers as a Christian nation. The problem is that when Christian nationalists take this view of history and they paint its founding as a Christian nation, they are again supporting a myth. And not only is that the case, the very concept of a Christian nation is misguided, and it is inconsistent with the true nature of Christianity. So now, I'm not going to deny that Christianity did have a significant influence on the founding of our nation, the United States. But the influence was mixed with the influence of deism and the philosophers like John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, and these are men who did not hold to traditional Christian views, and their ideas were also key to establishing America. Now, it's true that many of the colonists were Puritans and separatists who came here to establish societies based on their understanding of Christianity. It's not true, however, that they came to the New World for religious freedom. They came for freedom for their religion. They enforced their specific doctrines and rejected and persecuted anyone who drifted from them and differed from them theologically. In addition, while the Puritans of New England colonies were devout in their faith, it's not the full story of the founding of the United States in its colonial period. Many of the colonies were established for financial reasons rather than religious ones. Colonies such as Virginia, the Carolinas, Maryland, Georgia, New York, and Delaware were all established as a profit center rather than as a religious center. Furthermore, the first colony in the New World was established in 1607, and the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. That's a 169-year gap. To put that into perspective, that is a little longer gap than the gap between me and the recording of this video and the U.S. Civil War. So in that 169-year gap between the founding of the colonies and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, do you think there might have been some cultural shift that happened in that time? In fact, in the years leading to the Revolution, we saw some of the lowest church attendance in U.S. history. Christian nationalists also like to paint our founding fathers as these devout Christians. Now, if you were to talk about who are the founding fathers, that list can get really long if you include every single signer of the Declaration of Independence and representative at the Constitutional Convention. Christian nationalists like to cherry pick the most devout among this list and use them as representation of the founding fathers as a whole. That would be like future historians looking at Bernie Sanders or AOC and claiming that their views represent the government of our time. Now, many of these founding fathers had a rather minor role or minor influence in the formation of the United States. To really understand the position of the founding fathers, we need to restrict the list to those who had the most prominent positions and had the most influence on this country's founding. The renowned historian Richard B. Morris identified 7 people who he believed contributed in terms of leadership, longevity, and statesmanship to be considered the key founding fathers of the United States. So let's look at these 7 key founding fathers and what their religious views were. First, obviously, is George Washington, often called the father of the nation and first president of the United States. Now, Washington had a complicated religious belief system. And because of that, Christian nationalists can paint him as a model Christian, while secularists can paint him as a deist. Now, Washington was a member of the Episcopal Church, and he was raised by a devout Christian mother. His church attendance, however, was inconsistent, personally. During some periods of his life, he rarely attended worship services at all, and he was very faithful in his attendance at other points of his life. Once he took charge of the Continental Army, however, he stopped taking communion. It is known and recorded that he prayed and read his Bible privately at times, but he rarely referenced Jesus. Some of his religious language seemed more consistent with deism than Christianity, but explicitly recognized divine providence and guidance in the formation of the United States. So he couldn't have been a strict deist, but deistic ideas likely influenced some of his thoughts about God. One thing is clear, that he firmly believed in religious freedom for everyone. Moving on to the second founding father, we have Thomas Jefferson. He was the writer of the Declaration of Independence and third president of the United States. He was also a solid deist, believing God is real, but not active in the world. Jefferson appreciated the moral teachings of Jesus, but rejected the possibility of miraculous events happening. He famously cut all the miracles out of his Bible, leaving only the moral teachings. Third, we have Benjamin Franklin, signer of the Declaration of Independence, first Postmaster General, and just all-around key figure in the founding of our country. He was also a deist who actually mocked biblical ideas. I know there are places where you can see that he seemed to show some reverence towards biblical ideas, but John Jay, also a founding father, got so disturbed by Franklin's ridiculing of Christianity at parties that they both attended that John Jay would actually ask Franklin to play the glass harp for everyone, and Jay actually hated the glass harp, but he wanted to distract Franklin from his mockery of the Bible. The fourth founding father is John Adams, first vice president of the United States, second president. He was a Unitarian who denied the Trinitarian understanding of God. He claimed that other Christian traditions were full of superstition. After leaving office, he wrote a letter to his son, John Quincy Adams, in which he said, "An incarnate God, an eternal, self-existent, omnipresent, omniscient author of this stupendous universe suffering on a cross? My soul starts with horror at the idea, and it has stupefied the Christian world. It has been the source of almost all of the corruptions of Christianity." Therefore, John Adams viewed the idea of the crucifixion of an incarnate Jesus a corruption of Christianity, while most Christians, including myself, would consider this to be the heart of the Christian faith. Therefore, Adams rejected central core beliefs of the Christian faith and definitely would not classify and be considered an Orthodox Christian. Fifth on the list, we have Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury and the focus of the celebrated musical play. He seemed to have been raised Jewish, but associated himself with the Episcopal Church in his adulthood. He also demonstrated some inclinations towards deism. He didn't attend churches regularly. He was never baptized, nor did he ever receive communion. As he was dying, he requested communion, but was denied since he'd never been baptized into the Episcopal Church. He did confess Christ as he was dying. The sixth founding father was James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, major contributor to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and was the fourth president. Now, Madison was private about his personal religious beliefs, but he did not seem to hold to traditional Orthodox Christianity. His views were most likely more aligned with either Unitarianism or deism. He was very focused on personal conscience and believed that one's faith should be a matter of personal decision and personal conscience. He was the major drafter of the First Amendment of the Constitution, and he championed complete religious freedom and the separation of church and state. And the last of the seven key founding fathers was John Jay. He was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and John Jay was a devout Christian from the Reformed tradition. He believed that the United States should be a Christian nation, but it's not really clear what he meant by that. But John Jay would have been, and the Christian nationalist vision of the Founding Fathers, John Jay would have fit that. So in short, of the seven primary Founding Fathers, three rejected core teachings of Christianity. One's personal beliefs were ambiguous, but were most likely not Orthodox Christianity. Two had inconsistent church attendance at the Episcopal Church, but demonstrated deist sympathies. And only one had devout Christian beliefs and unambiguously embraced the core teachings of Orthodox Christianity. Now consider this group of people, and consider if this is a group of people who would have established a distinctly Christian nation. Now let's move beyond just the personal beliefs of our founding fathers to the documents that truly define the United States of America. Now, Christian nationalists insist that these documents are rooted in biblical principles. Now, the first of these major founding documents is the Declaration of Independence. Its most famous line is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, Christian nationalists cling to this phrase in this section of the Declaration of Independence to point to our Christian heritage as Americans. Now, the text does here acknowledge that there is a Creator, and that Creator is the source of our rights. And elsewhere, the document does reference the laws of nature and God and nature's God. But let's think about who penned these words. Now, anyone who knows the basis of American history knows that the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson, who, as I explained earlier, was a deist. Fellow deist Benjamin Franklin and Unitarian John Adams were editors for the Declaration of Independence. Therefore, the Declaration of Independence is not the product of Christian authors. Furthermore, let's look at what the Declaration of Independence actually says about this Creator, and let's see how what it's saying about the Creator doesn't align with what the Bible says about the Creator. And they don't even claim that these are biblical ideas. It doesn't say the Scriptures clearly establish that all men are created equal. They said, according to the Declaration of Independence, that this is a self-evident truth. In other words, it's based on reason and logic and their personal philosophical concepts. Now, where does the Bible emphasize, by the way, God endowing us with unalienable rights? Where does that language appear in the Bible? It doesn't. Furthermore, among these supposed unalienable rights, the Declaration lists are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are not the focus of biblical values. Rather than focusing on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Jesus calls us in Matthew 16:24 and 25 to saying, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Christian ethics aren't about fighting to defend our rights, but sacrificing our rights and liberties for the welfare of others. Christians are to devote themselves to a life of sacrifice rather than the pursuit of happiness. And Christians are to be ready to sacrifice their lives for what is right. These are not biblical concepts. So as inspiring as these words may be for patriotic Americans, biblically speaking, it is a theologically inaccurate statement that isn't harmonious with biblical values at all. Jefferson did not draw these words from the scripture, or these ideas from the scripture. He got them from the philosophy of John Locke, who advocated natural theology that is drawn from reason and observation of the world rather than the revelation of scriptures. So this statement is a prime example of how American ideals have warped the thinking of American Christians so that unbiblical notions of God and the Christian faith become ingrained into our thinking, so much so that when we hear them, we just assume that, yes, the Bible must endorse that somewhere. Now, the Declaration of Independence is also is a very important document for American history, but it actually has no legal authority. The basis of our country's laws and government is the Constitution. Now, I read the Constitution multiple times, specifically looking for these distinctively biblical ideas that I had been told were there. Now, as someone with 3 degrees in the Bible and theology, and who's taught at the world's largest evangelical seminary, I think I'm qualified to recognize biblical concepts when I see them. So again, I specifically went back to the Constitution and scoured it over and over again, looking for distinctly biblical ideas. I didn't find any. And so next time someone tells you that the Bible is based on biblical ideas, ask them like what? Now they will mention some certain concepts that are in the Constitution that they then can squint and read into the Bible. But that isn't the same thing. This is modern readers making the Bible fit the Constitution rather than the framers of the Constitution consulting the Bible for ideas about a biblical concept for government. Now, the most well-known part of the Constitution and the most emphasized by Christian nationalists is the First Amendment, although Christian nationalists have been putting an increasing emphasis on the Second Amendment in recent years. But let's look at this First Amendment specifically and see what it says, especially the Establishment Clause regarding religious freedom. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Now, while the specific language here emphasizes Congress, i.e. the legislature, the branch that writes the laws, it is, however, understood that these rights would be respected by the executive and judicial branches, as well as in that their roles are to execute and rule on the Constitution and the laws passed by the legislature. Now, this Establishment Clause has 2 parts. The first is a prohibition against establishing respecting an establishment of religion. In other words, showing partiality or acting in order to advance a particular religion. And the second is prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, they can't restrict anyone's religious practice, including banning or persecuting adherents of any religion. Now, this establishment clause is the foundation of the idea of separation of church and state. Now, Christian nationalists love to point out that these specific words don't appear in the text of the Constitution. They're right. But you know what? The word Trinity doesn't appear anywhere in the pages of the Bible. Trinity is a word developed by the theologian Tertullian about 100 years after the completion of the New Testament to describe a biblical concept. Likewise, Thomas Jefferson coined the phrase separation of church and state to describe the constitutional concepts in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Jefferson used this term in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Church. Now, as a young man, I heard Christian nationalists explain that Jefferson insisted that this was a one-way wall that kept the state out of the church, but not the church out of the state. Jefferson says no such thing. I invite you to look up the letter for yourself. It can be found with a quick Google search. It's very short, only 3 paragraphs long. The pertinent part reads, believing with you that religion is a matter which solely lies between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their religion should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, adhering to the expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his nature, rights convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. The Christian nationalist understanding of a one-way wall recognizes the second half of the Establishment Clause, but limits the government from prohibiting the free exercise of religion, but denies that the first half of the Establishment Clause that prohibits the government from endorsing a specific religion or showing partiality towards one, and they deny that section. The only other religious reference in the Constitution is in Article 6, which states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. Therefore, when Christian nationalists advocate that only Christians should hold public office, they are advocating unconstitutional ideas. In short, the Constitution takes a deliberately neutral stance with regard to religion. There are those at the founding of this nation who didn't want this, who would want an explicitly religious country. One of the primary criticisms of the Constitution at the time that it was written was that there was no mention of God. There is undoubtedly people involved with establishing the United States who wanted it to be a Christian nation. But the Constitution Convention ultimately decided on a government that was religiously independent, that allowed all religions to be freely practiced and without restraint or interference from the government or endorsement by the government. And since the Constitution is the foundation of the nation, its religious neutrality should be sufficient to dispel the myth that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. However, there's another key piece of evidence dispelling the Christian nation myth, which is the Treaty of Tripoli that was signed in 1797. This is a very early treaty, one of the first treaties that our nation signed. And the negotiations for this treaty began during Washington's presidency and was ultimately signed by our founding father and second president, John Adams. In Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli, it states, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, and it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religious, or tranquility of Muslims, as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against Mohammedan nation. It is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interpretation of the harmony existing between these two countries. So not only does this treaty explicitly deny that the United States is a Christian nation, the religious neutrality and the freedom of all religions is explicitly extended to Muslims. Therefore, the Christian nationalists' contention that the First Amendment was intended to be applied to only various denominations of Christianity and not a defense of, putting Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Buddhism and Hinduism and all of the other religions all on the same level. They're going to say, no, this only applies to sects of Christianity, different denominations. But when we see what they said in the Treaty of Tripoli, that doesn't hold water. Now, Christian nationalists will try to reframe those who affirm the U.S. was religiously neutral to pushing a narrative that the U.S. was hostile to Christianity. They will cite various quotes by founding fathers in which they acknowledge God's providence or make a biblical allusion in their remarks to challenge the notion that the founding fathers were hostile to Christianity. Now I'd say that this is by and large a straw man argument that mischaracterizes those who oppose their Christian nationalist agenda. To the degree that anyone does try to paint the founding fathers as anti-Christian, they are wrong. The founding fathers weren't anti-Christian. But I've listed, know a lot of atheists. I've listened to many atheist speakers, and they all have very strong left-wing politics and strong advocates for the complete separation of church and state. I don't know any of them who advocate the government taking a hostile stance towards Christianity. Now, they might personally challenge the truth claims of Christianity, and they oppose any government actions that would favor Christianity. It is a lie, however, though, that they want to see the government in any way restrict the private exercise of Christianity or any other religion. Christian nationalists have a strong with me or against me mindset that believes that if the government isn't favoring Christianity, then it must be hostile to Christianity. The founding fathers, however, had their own faiths, and they weren't hostile to the expression of those faiths. However, they did enshrine in the Constitution the core principle of religious neutrality, not hostility, but neutrality, so that all are free to express their views, and each person can decide their religious beliefs as their own conscience dictates, apart from the government coercion. This is a position that was welcomed by many devout Christian groups, including the Quakers and the Baptists, who viewed separation of church and state as a pillar of their own personal doctrines. It's ironic that Baptists are some of the leading Christian nationalists today, when a core Baptist doctrine was the separation of church and state. Now, as this nation progressed, it didn't always live up to its core values of total religious liberty, just as it didn't honor the equality of all during its years of slavery, Jim Crow, or pre-woman suffrage. In 1892, the Supreme Court ruling, Holy Trinity versus the United States, made a passing reference to the United States being a Christian nation. It isn't clear what they meant by this declaration when they said it's a Christian nation, but when I read it in context, it seems to merely be an acknowledgement of the prevalence of Christian expression in American culture. Either way, this ruling was in 1892, over a century after the ratification of the Constitution, and if it meant to make an official declaration, it was clearly out of line with the will of the Founding Fathers or the core principles of the nation. The line of separation of church and state really got blurred, though, during the Cold War. In response to our enmity towards the communist Soviet Union and its atheistic stance, Americans painted itself as a nation of faith. It was during this time that "In God We Trust" was started to be imprinted in our currency, and "One Nation Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. In the wake of the 1950s Red Scare, and the myth of Christian nationalism was born. American patriotism, capitalism, and Christian faith got muddled together, forming the foundation of what is now the Christian nationalist identity. But again, this idea that America is a Christian nation was merely a myth. Now, even if a Christian nationalist can dig up some historical evidence contradicting the fundamental historical facts that I've presented and demonstrate conclusively that the Founding Fathers intended the United States to be a Christian nation, I'm going to say straight up, they failed. If Christian nationalists say even if the Founding Fathers didn't intend us to be a Christian nation, we should be one, and we're going to make one now, I say those efforts will fail as well. And prior to the founding of the United States, there were countless other kingdoms established in the Western world under the assumption that they were Christian nations. They had state churches and the like. Every one of them failed to establish a Christian nation. Going all the way back to Rome and Emperor Constantine, every attempt to blend church and state have failed to establish a Christian nation. This is because the myth that the United States is a Christian nation is built upon an even bigger myth that a nation can be Christian. The term Christian nation is oxymoronic. The very concept is flawed at a foundational level. The promise of a Christian nation is so enticing for Christians, but when they seek to define what it means, the problem with the concept starts to appear. By a Christian nation, they usually mean that they want the laws to be based on biblical values, and they want government to publicly endorse or encourage Christianity in some form or fashion. So let's begin with laws, that idea of the laws reflecting biblical values. Does adhering to a collection of laws make you a Christian? Furthermore, when the government pushes any belief or ideology, whether it be Christianity or a philosophical idea or whatever, it inevitably leads to some type of coercion towards pushing that belief. And can someone be coerced into the Christian faith? So before attempting to define what a Christian nation is, one should remind themselves of what it means to be a Christian. Romans 10:5 and 10 says, "For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that a person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved." Being a Christian is about putting your faith in Jesus. This faith is explicitly contrasted with a system of ethics based upon following a set of laws. Now, if the laws God gave Moses are insufficient to make one Christian, how much more would any human attempt to replicate them in a civil legal system also be insufficient to make someone Christian or a nation Christian? The text of Romans also explains that faith must come from the heart. Coercion can elicit a verbal affirmation. If the population is promised benefits for pledging fealty to an ideology, or if the government threatens people if they don't pledge their fealty to an ideology or belief system, you're going to have no shortage of people joining up. How many of them, however, are believing with their heart? You know, evangelicals used to have this mantra of sorts. I don't hear it much anymore, but they used to say, Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. Now, I've heard critics of this idea attack the notion, arguing that and explain that, Christianity is a religion, and, it depends on how you define religion. Christianity certainly would fall under the definition of many definitions of Christianity. But what did they actually mean by that adage that Christianity isn't a religion but a relationship? They meant that at its heart, being a Christian isn't about following the rules or participating in rituals. It's about knowing God through faith in Jesus Christ. And on that basis, I'd agree that Christianity isn't a religion but a relationship, because it's not just a bunch of rules and rituals. It is that personal faith in Jesus Christ. So with that in mind, let's return to the preposterous notion of a Christian nation. I ask you, can a nation put its faith in Jesus? Faith is an individual personal decision that cannot be made at a corporate level, especially not at a national level. Pushing for a Christian nation ultimately is advocating for Christianity to be the recognized religion of the nation in some form or fashion. Whatever expression that takes, it involves transforming Christianity from a matter of personal faith to a religion, a set of rules and rituals. So it is transforming Christianity from that relationship to a religion. Therefore, making the United States a Christian nation morphs Christianity in something that it is not. As I referenced earlier, the first attempt at a Christian nation was actually at a Christian empire. Constantine desired to form that Christian empire by declaring Christianity the official religion of Rome. This had an immediate transformative effect on Christianity, and the implications are still felt to this day. Prior to Constantine, Christianity was marked by simple worship and done strictly by the faithful, a group of people who were themselves persecuted for those beliefs. When Constantine made Christianity the official religion, persecution did end, but Christian worship developed into the pageantry that it's often associated with today. Many people did join the church, not out of true faith and devotion, but because it was politically and socially beneficial to be a Christian after that point. Most disturbing of all, however, the government started inflicting civil penalties for dissenting religious views. Most notable, and probably first, was with Arius and the Council of Nicaea. Now, I agree with the decision of Nicaea. I think the Nicene Creed is a powerful statement of faith. I don't agree with Constantine, however, banishing Arius for his beliefs and that are contrary to the decision of the council at Nicaea. Now, even though I think Arius' views and beliefs are a corruption of the Bible's teaching, I don't think that civil penalties should be enacted for personal religious beliefs. But with the establishment of a state church and official doctrinal positions, the formerly persecuted Christians became the persecutors. This tradition continued for over 1,000 years, finding its fulfillment in the Inquisition of the Catholic Church. And even as the Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church, they continued the legacy of persecuting dissenters. John Calvin famously had Michael Servetus executed for his theology. And the Puritan colonialists, who Christian nationalists loved to glorify, not only executed witches, but persecuted other Christians whom they held different beliefs than them, such as Baptists and Quakers. The Baptist minister Obadiah Holmes was famously whipped so viciously in Massachusetts for preaching his views that contradicted the Puritans of Massachusetts He was whipped so badly that he had to rest on his knees and elbows for days because his back was too raw for him to lay down on it. Yes, this is persecution of Christians, of other Christians, right here in the on U.S. soil, in those lovely Christian colonies that people want to exalt in the Christian nationalist movement. Don't be fooled. This is what we can expect from a Christian nation. Once the government sides with Christianity, they will start discriminating against or even straight out persecuting non-Christians. And they will inevitably begin to discriminate and persecute against Christians with the wrong views of Christianity as decided by the state. Once the church unites itself to the government, the church will inevitably be seduced by the lure of worldly power and be corrupted by it. Pastor Tony Campello famously said that mixing the church and state is like mixing ice cream and manure. It doesn't do much for the manure, but it sure does ruin the ice cream. It's possible for a nation to declare itself Christian without altering but in doing so, they're going to alter and corrupt what it means to be Christian. Therefore, the very concept of a Christian nation is a myth. There is no such thing as a Christian nation. Christianity is inherently incompatible with the notion of being a state religion. However, it is possible to establish a nation, potentially, of Christians. That is, not a Christian nation, but a nation of Christians. By this I mean that it's possible for a large portion of the nation's population to be true believing Christians. In such a nation, one would expect Christian values to have an influence on society at large. And there is an argument to be made that the United States was at times in its history a nation of Christians. Now, I don't think that establishing a nation of Christians should be the goal of Christians today, and that our primary objective shouldn't be to try to enact social change and therefore get people to conform to Christianity and believe in Christianity for the purpose of that social change. I do, however, deeply want to see people come to faith in Jesus Christ. And if an overwhelming majority of Americans started believing in Jesus and sought to live according to his teachings, I would be happy. I would welcome that. However, political activism and legislation won't lead to mass conversions to Christianity. Especially at the level it would take to establish a nation of Christians. Government and political promotion of Christianity will have two effects. One, these measures would encourage many insincere converts who join for political or social reasons rather than genuine spiritual renewal, and the church will be filled with hypocrites. Second, others will be repelled by the efforts to force their conformity to religious rules and regulations that violate their conscience and personal beliefs. As a result, they will become more resistant to believing in Jesus. Both of these effects will have the same ultimate result. People will turn away from Christianity. They will want nothing to do with Christianity because of all the hypocrisy that they see amongst the church and those who promote Christianity. And they will reject Christianity because they resent being forced or coerced into Christianity. Both things lead to a rejection of Christianity and a rejection of Christ. And we can see that since the 1980s, when the religious right arose and began pushing their agenda, Christianity has been on the decline. In the 1970s, 90% of Americans identified as Christians, and now we're closer to 60%. And Christian nationalists like to point to all these different factors that are associated with this declining Christianity. But it seems to me that the harder their Christian nationalist agenda is pushed, the more people turn away from Christianity. They are the reason for the decline rather than the solution. What they are doing isn't working, and it isn't biblical. The Romans 10 passage I read from earlier about the need for people to believe from their heart goes on to say in verses 14 through 15, "How then will they call on him whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? How are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." If you really want to see the spiritual state of this nation turn around, stop pushing a political agenda and devote your efforts to proclaiming the gospel message that Jesus died for us so that whoever believes in him can have eternal life. Preaching the gospel was the focus of the church and Christian preachers for 200 years here in this country, and Christianity flourished during that time. When preachers started focusing on a political agenda, Christianity started to decline. They abandoned the pure Christian faith in pursuit of the myth of a Christian nation. Now, those of you who are listening, and you are Christian, I urge you, plead with you, to abandon the misguided aspirations of establishing a Christian nation and start focusing on preaching the gospel. Now, if you're listening and you are not a Christian, please don't let the corruption of Christianity by Christian nationalists turn you away from the eternal blessings that come from faith in Jesus Christ. Christian nationalism doesn't accurately represent what Christianity is all about. There are many Christians who reject that kind of Christianity. I'm not that kind of Christian.